John Smith. However, when I was born with darker skin than all my sisters and black corn husk hair, my grandfather knew that I would face the same choice he once had to. The first thing my grandfather supposedly ever said to me was "Loa sholi chihololi," meaning "carry the fire, my love." These are the words by which I live by, and I have them permanently marked on my ribs in the same place where my grandfather was once stabbed. This is a story familiar to many Indigenous peoples who have been driven from their homelands and isolated from their culture and their people. But this is not the end of us. We still have power and fire to carry on, and it is individuals like Dr. Kimmerer who help us keep our cultures and history alive. Dr. Kimmerer's work not only carries the fire of the past generations, reinvigorating the relationship our ancestors had with our beloved earth, but it speaks hope into those of us who have difficulty carrying the fire on our own. In the opening chapter of Braiding Sweetgrass, Dr. Kimmerer recounts the joy of braiding together as children, weaving strands of mind, body, and spirit together, creating a tight plate connecting us to each other as well as the earth, our mother. Today, I hope that this conversation can embody that spirit of earthly and interpersonal communion. So with those words, I would like to be the first to say Chokma and welcome to Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Mahela, miigwech for those beautiful words and that powerful story that you have shared. I'm inspired and so grateful for your words. I would say bonjour, shabadas gegish kokwene deshnakas, bodwe wad mikoenda, megaze dodem minwa mako dodem, miigwech kinigego gamijong. For the reasons that Mahela just shared with us, I don't speak much of my language, but my language teachers ask us to breathe life into it every chance that we get. And so I've told you that my name is Light Shining Through Sky Woman. I'm a Potawatomi woman, Anishinaabe, and I am a member of the Bear Clan and also of the Eagles. And I am so grateful for all of the gifts that surround us, including your presence and the community that we share this evening. I want to, because we are spending so much time staring at our screens, I want to invite our more than human relatives from outdoors to come in with us. So I'm going to share the screen so that, there we go. There we are. All right, good. I'm glad that's working so that we can invite our plant and animal relatives inside to share with us. I also should say, by way of introduction, it's just about twilight here where I live on an old farm in upstate New York, and my neighbor's peacocks really yell about this moment. So if you hear blood-curdling cries in the background, it's just the peacocks saying good night to all of you. Let's see. Come on, slides. Hold on. My slides are not advancing. There had to be some kind of technical glitch. Let's see. There we go. All righty. It is also our traditional protocol to always begin with gratitude. And we can cast our minds back to this morning when we first put our feet on Mother Earth and remember that we had everything that we need. We had a drink of cool water. We had a breath of air given to us by the trees. We had food. We had the companionship of one another, of clouds and geese and the forest around us. We had everything that we needed. Gratitude for each other as people, for the privilege of our work, and for the original peoples whose homelands we meet today. And I'm speaking to you from the edge of the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, in the heart of Haudenosaunee territory. Here's Onondaga Nation. I live right over the hill from that reservation. And I want to, as you did so appropriately, acknowledge where I stand, and to say that it is a privilege to be a neighbor of Haudenosaunee Onondaga peoples, and to remember the debt, the unpaid debt of land, of history, and certainly of philosophy and practice of land care that were passed on to us by our Haudenosaunee neighbors. I also always introduce myself because I feel it so deeply as a member of Maple Nation, of Sugar Maple Nation. We're just a few days off from when there was still snow on the ground, and the Anonitig, our sugar maple relatives, were giving us their first gift of the season of maple sap. And as a citizen of Maple Nation, I recognize that as a human person, compared to the citizenry of maples, they are really the leading citizens of our community in the way that they provide for us and for all the biodiversity around us. They're certainly more numerous than we are, more influential, more important, and they have none of the rights and privileges of citizenship that I, as a member of the human species, am privileged to have. And that question of the rights of citizenship for the more than human world is a question we will talk about tonight. And you know, when we think about all of these gifts that we have been given by Shkokmikwe, by Mother Earth, the question comes forward, of course, of what is our response to all of these gifts? What do we do in response to them? And this, even though we are showered with all of these gifts, we find ourselves harnessed to an economic system, to social systems that are relentlessly asking us, what more can we take from the earth? Instead of the question that I think we should be asking, which is, what does the earth ask of us? And this notion that we can endlessly take from the earth, this exploitative worldview, is to me the most dangerous influences that have us hovering on the brink of climate catastrophe and entering the age of the sixth extinction. So tonight we'll consider that question. What does the earth ask of us? And how do we begin to answer it? Well, what does the earth ask of us really depends on what worldview we are situated in. It depends on what we mean by the nature of nature. This exact question that is the theme, the idea of nature of your seminar series. So let's think about that. What does land mean? And when I say land, I mean big L land, even though it's a little L there. Big, I mean all of land, not just terrestrial habitats. What does land mean through the Western lens in a conventional framework? Certainly land is understood as capital, isn't it? Sometimes almost synonymous with it. Land as natural resources, the utilitarian view of land, as if all these gifts that surround us were of little value until we converted them into commodities. Land as property, one of the signal meanings of land through the Western worldview. And when we say that land is property, what we're saying is that we have rights to that land, to treat it, if it is our property, we can treat the land however we wish, dispose of it, etc. We also think oftentimes about land as ecosystem services, those functions that the land provides for all of us. Little things like water purification and food production and soil building and oxygen. All of those things are tied up in this Western view of what does land mean. But in my work at the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to bring together the powerful traditions of Western science and the powerful traditions of Indigenous science, philosophy, and practice. We remind ourselves that we want to look at the world with two eyes, through both lenses. Yes, the familiar, conventional Western scientific framework, but until quite recently, that was the only framework that ever appeared in Western academics, as if there was only one way to think about the land and our ideas of nature. How much more would we see and understand? How much more creative would our solutions for sustainability be if we looked at the world with two eyes, with the Indigenous framework as well as the Western? And that's what we're going to do to think about land again, land through the Indigenous lens, in which land is understood as the source of our identity as people. That Native people's identity is inseparable from the land herself. We also understand the land as our caretaker, the one who sustains us, and the ones who we then sustain, Not only is the land our own home, but it is the residence of our non-human relatives, our great big family of bear people and birch people and camas people, as you see in this slide. Land is understood as our ancestral connection. It is the connection to those who made the path that we are walking on. It is also the place where the path that we make will leave its footprints for those who follow. They meet on the land. The land is understood through the Indigenous lens as a teacher, as a library, as a source of knowledge. It's also understood as pharmacy or our healer, both physical and spiritual, because the land is alive, the land is inspirited, it is animate, because the land is in all senses of belonging, our home. And instead of viewing land as a place to which we have rights, captured in that notion of land as property and property rights, through the Indigenous lens, this notion of having rights over land makes no sense, because land is the place where we enact our moral responsibility to all of the sources of life. That's what happens on the land, because the land is sacred. If this is what land means, we answer the question, what does the earth ask of us, in a very different way. And when we think about land as sustainer or natural resources, ecosystem services, we think of all of the provisioning that the land does, the way that the land takes care of us. This collage of photos is just to remind us of some of the gifts of plants. And notice I say gifts, not commodities. Words matter. The words that we use matter so much. Do we think about what the land provides for us as natural resources, as our property, as not intrinsically valued, but only valued when converted? Or do we think about the world as gift, that the sustenance that we are provided are the gifts of our more than human relatives? I was once giving a talk at a Department of Natural Resources. Maybe you have one. And they were thinking about changing their name of their department. And they're going through many permutations of natural resources. And I suggested to them that they rename their department the Department of Earthly Gifts. And you should have seen the soft smiles that went across that whole audience of natural resource professionals. And everybody said, I want to work for a Department of Earthly Gifts. And yet, we continue on this path of thinking of the world as natural resources or commodities. But it wasn't always that way. The oldest formulation of this notion of natural resources to me comes from the metaphor and the treaty that between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee that speaks of the land as the gifts of Mother Earth coming to us as a bowl of berries, as if there was one bowl and one spoon. This metaphor as a policy for caring for the earth is a powerful one because it reminds us that that bowl is finite. It can't be endlessly harvested, that our job as humans is to keep that bowl replenished for others, and very importantly, that there is just one spoon, and it's the same size for all of us. It is a statement about justice for people and justice for land as well, isn't it? This notion of the land as gift and the question of how do we respond to gift is a central one. And it relates, of course, to this notion of sustainability, a term that I'm sure you use all the time. We all do in the fields of environment and conservation. But let's interrogate that term just a little bit. A colleague of mine talks about asking her tribal council for a grant to go to a sustainability meeting. And they asked her to explain what sustainability was. And she kind of laughed, saying, well, that's the way our people have lived well in place for millennia without exhausting the land. And but then she gave them these definitions that we all know, we all use them in our work. This idea of maintaining environmental resources so that they continue to provide for us, that it enables growth while ensuring future generations' ability to do the same. You know these definitions, right? Her elders were quiet about her request. And then they said, yes, you go to that meeting, but we want you to carry a message. And their response was this, looking through that other lens, that sounds to me like they're just trying to find a way to keep on taking. It's always just taking. When our feet hit the ground in the morning, we should be thinking, what can we give? Sustainability through that other lens becomes completely reframed around this question of what does the earth ask of us, of understanding humans not simply as takers, as consumers, but as givers, as participants that can be returning the gifts that the earth gives to us. In fact, our oldest teachings tell us that all people, and by all people, I mean berry people and bird people and human people, we were all given gifts. But those gifts are tied to a responsibility. Like the thrushes that got the gift of that beautiful song. They were given the responsibility to sing to us in the morning and the evening. The stars were given that gift of twinkle and the responsibility to guide us. And so gifts and responsibilities are two sides of the same coin. So asking what is our responsibility in return for the gifts of the earth can also be what are our gifts as human people and how do we give them in the world? That's what we're going to talk about together tonight in response to the question of what does the earth ask of us? That we give our gifts, that we exercise our responsibilities. This question of what does the earth ask of us was so important to Indigenous peoples. And I would tell you just a fragment of a creation story that embodies the importance of this for both Haudenosaunee people, whose territories I live today, as well as Anishinaabe people, Potawatomi people. I'll tell you just a tiny fragment of this story that says that in the beginning, the people lived in the sky world, much as we do here on the earth below, growing their gardens, raising their families, playing games. It was very much as it is here, except for the trees. The tree that grew in the sky world was the tree of light. And on the branches of that tree grew every kind of plant that was known. All the grasses, all the berries, all the medicines, all the fruits, everything on one tree. And it is said that a great storm passed through the sky world and toppled the tree of light, as you see in this beautiful artwork. And emerging from her lodge in the morning, a beautiful young woman by the name of Gige Kokwe went over to that tree, and she looked down where the tree had pulled up from the earth. And instead of seeing rocks and soil as you would expect, it was only blackness and the light from the sky world piercing through that hole. She said, "How can that be?" And she stepped closer to the edge of that hole, and she started to slip. The land started to crumble at her feet. So she reached behind her to the tree of light to steady herself. And the branch broke off in her hand, and she fell. She fell like a maple seed pirouetting on an autumn breeze, with her arms outstretched and her hair billowing behind her into the darkness, into the emptiness. Imagine how afraid she was. But it was not empty. In fact, in the water world below, they saw this sudden shaft of light open into their world, and in it they saw the speck, like a dust mote in the beam, coming toward them. And as it grew closer, they could see it was a woman. And so the geese rose from the water, flew up and met her, and they caught Gish Kokwe in the strong wings of the geese. We are told in this creation story that the very first encounter between human people and the other people of the earth was rescue, was comfort and love and responsibility that those other animal beings showed to this poor, helpless newcomer. They lowered her down to the water world where there was no land at all. And the turtle said, "You may rest on my back." And all the beings knew that she couldn't stay there forever, that they would have to somehow make a home for her. And they remembered the old stories that there was mud down at the bottom of the water. And they said, "We'll go get her some and make her land." And the strongest of the swimmers said, "I'll go first." That was Mong Maloon. And he went down, he dove right down to get that mud. And when he came back, he didn't have it. It was too far, too cold, too deep. He said, "I can't do it." So one by one, the other animals, each in their turn, tried and failed. The sturgeon, the otter, the beaver, until the only one that was left was the little muskrat. And he said, "I will go." And of course, his relatives were pretty skeptical about his chances for success. But he went. He kicked his legs and he flailed his little arms, and down he went. And he was gone for a very, very long time. Too long. And a little stream of bubbles came up from the water, followed by the limp body of the muskrat, who had given his life for this woman. And they noticed that his hand was closed. And when they opened it, there it was, the little nugget of earth from the bottom of the water. So grateful was Gige Kokwe for this gift that she said, "Here, give it to me." And in her hands, she rubbed it over the back of the willing turtle, and she began to sing her songs of heartfelt gratitude at the gift of the other animals. And as a result of her gratitude, the earth began to grow. And she did the women's dance, caressing that earth with her feet. And the earth began to grow and grow until it is today, Turtle Island, that we all inhabit. But like any good guest, she had not come empty-handed. She had in her hand the branch from the tree of light that had all the plants, which she sowed over the surface of the earth, giving us the home that we know today. The power of this story, what does the earth ask of us, answers for us gratitude and reciprocity, that we can return our gift. The earth was new then when it welcomed the first human. It's old now, and some have suspect we have worn out our welcome. Together, the gifts of gratitude and reciprocity created what we know today as our earthly home. In the beginning of the world, the other species were our life draft. And now, in the spirit of reciprocity, we must be theirs. What is it that we will give in return for the gift of the earth? How will we answer this question? What does the earth ask of us? As Guige Coquet and this formative creation story taught us, gratitude is our first responsibility. Now, gratitude might seem like weak tea given the urgent crises that we face today of climate change, diversity loss, everything that it bears on our shoulders. But gratitude is actually very powerful medicine. It's a lot more than, excuse me, a simple thank you, because in practicing gratitude, we recognize how interconnected we are. We recognize that while the rest of the earth can live without us, we cannot live without them. It turns out that the practice of gratitude, as Sky Woman taught us, as Guige Coquet taught us, also has very practical significance in addition to its spiritual significance. Our Indigenous storytelling tradition is full of stories about the failure of gratitude. When people fail to be grateful for the gifts of the earth, the spring dries up. When they are disrespectful of the corn doesn't grow. When they don't give gratitude for the lives of the animals don't return. Gratitude is powerful in that it creates a sense of enoughness, of sufficiency. It makes you feel content. And being content in a society which is so driven by consumption, by these messages that, oh, you're not enough, you have to have more, you have to consume more. Practicing gratitude and contentment is a truly radical act. To practice radical gratitude is to live with contentment. And eco-psychologists have told us that people who practice gratitude consume less than people who don't. Isn't it interesting to think that this emotion that we have could in fact put the brakes on the consumption that is driving us to the brink of climate catastrophe? Gratitude is powerful also because as human people, we know what we want to do when someone gives us a gift, right? We say thank you, and then we immediately start thinking, what can I give them? Gratitude is the doorway to reciprocity. Gratitude and reciprocity lead us to that place to think about how could we live in such a way that the earth would be grateful for us. The earth calls us to reciprocity. And what does that look like? How do we live reciprocity? There's so many answers to that. Tonight we'll have a chance to just explore a little bit. I put this word collage together to try to begin answering that question. How do we reciprocate the gifts of the earth? By returning gifts of our own, which might be science, doing good science. Art, being a maker, a creator is a way to return a gift to the earth. Justice work, restoration, cleaning up the messes that we have made, healing the earth, regenerative agriculture, regenerative economies, good environmental policy and law, land care, respect, the ways that we reciprocate the gifts of the earth. We raise gardens, we raise good kids, and when needed, we raise a ruckus. What does the earth ask of us? Another gift that we humans have, and a responsibility to use it, is the gift of attention. We call it paying attention for a good reason, because it comes at a cost. It takes energy and focus, right, to pay attention. And every one of us is gifted with that ability. But there are many forces at work that crave our attention, right? That distract and pull our attention in directions that are perhaps not what we intended and are not of benefit to the living communities around us. But in a world that gives us maple syrup and salamanders and wood thrushes, shouldn't we at least be paying attention? To pay attention means that we know the status of our neighbors. We might know their names. How can they come to us for help? How can we offer our help if we don't even know who they are? Paying attention gives us the capacity to respond, to be responsible. And that too is a gift, because when we fall in love with the living world, we cannot be bystanders to its destruction. Attention becomes intention, and intention becomes action. And it all begins with noticing. And noticing includes knowing the names of the beings who are around us. Maybe you know this little neighbor, probably growing in your yard at this moment, just coming up from the winter. I'd like to include this as an example of knowing the names of plants. And, that's not just because I'm a botany professor, might have something to do with it, but we need to know the names of beings around us because it's a sign of respect to know who your neighbors are, a sign of disrespect to ignore them. This little plant is called Heal All. If you know only the name of one plant, this would be a good place to start. And for the most part, our literacy with knowing the names of plants and animals around us has diminished exponentially over the last generation. Our grandparents knew hundreds of birds and plants and insects because they had to, because they lived on the land. It was a matter of survival, of knowing who your neighbors are. Did you know that the average American school child can recognize 100 different corporate logos and only 10 plants? What has happened here? Our attention has been hijacked away from those relatives, those gifts, those neighbors, and toward the icons of consumerism. Learning the names of plants and animals is a powerful act of support on their behalf. It opens the door to reciprocity. What else does the earth ask of us? It asks for respect. There's lots of ways to manifest that respect, but one of the most powerful is in recognition of the personhood of the beings who are around us. What do I mean by personhood? Let's follow that path a bit. You're probably all familiar. I need a drink. Thank you, water. You're probably all familiar with this notion of linguistic imperialism, which is the imposition of a settler colonial language atop the language of the original peoples that both Michaela and I are altogether too familiar with in the way that language was taken from our families. And linguistic imperialism is a powerful tool of colonization. It not only changes names, but changes concepts and says, what you call that, we call this, and its meaning may change, not only in place names, but in important concepts of this little word, it. Pretty innocuous word, huh? Let's look at our relatives there, the salamander and the berry and the bear and grandmother moon in the sky. In English, how do we refer to them? We point to that robin and say it is singing, right? The butterfly, it is pollinating. In English, which is a noun-based language, all members of the living world, unless we care to call them he or she, which oftentimes doesn't make a lot of sense, but we still sometimes do it, we call them it, don't we? As a scientist, when I write my scientific papers about the beings who have taught me so much, I have to call them it in my work. That's unsettling for me. That's deeply disturbing. Maybe you've felt that way too. Because would I ever say of you, it is listening on Zoom? Of course not. Why not? Why don't we say it to each other? Because it robs us of humanity. It takes our dignity. It robs us of personhood. It means that we are an object, that we are no longer a person or a being worthy of respect, which is why we're talking about what does the earth ask of us? Respect. Is it respectful to call the rest of the world it and reserve a grammar of respect for members of our own species? I don't think so. Itting the world in English, it's no surprise that English is the language of capitalism. It's the world, which can bring us to thinking about the earthly gifts as natural resources, as ecosystem services, not the gifts of our relatives, but things. It is a kind of a permission to exploit the living world for stuff, for commodities. I am a beginning, that I forgot this slide, that the consequences of objectification, when we call that robin it, when we call that bear or that tree it, they are excluded from our circle of moral responsibility, aren't they? And that's where this permission to convert them to commodities comes from. If we had to say of a tree, of a forest, I'm going to cut her down, that's a very different proposition than I'm going to cut it down, isn't it? In the Potawatomi language, that's impossible. We can't speak of these butterflies or the asters or the goldenrod as it. Potawatomi and many other indigenous languages are verb-based. It isn't actually based in pronouns, but in the way that we speak with verbs. Because we have animate verbs, we have ways of speaking of living beings that elevate them, that show respect to them because they are alive. We have ways of speaking that are reserved for objects as well, but we would never use those inanimate verb forms to speak of living beings. It would be disrespectful. It would be like itting them. And so in the Potawatomi language, it's a language which shows respect for the personhood of all beings. We use the same grammar for plants and animals as we do for our family because they are our family. Inspired by this way of thinking and deeply troubled by the itting of the world and the permissions that seems to give in English, I have made a modest proposal that we think about reclaiming this grammar of animacy, grammar of the granting the life and personhood of the living world by creating new pronouns in the English language inspired by the notion of animacy in Indigenous languages. And I worked with my language teacher on this important concept. Stuart Kingbun was my esteemed teacher. And Here's what we came up with. I was wandering through the woods and the fields and the wetlands listening. What are they calling each other? What is the language that living beings use for each other? And within the Potawatomi language, there is a word for an earth being. Oops, I see there's a mistake here. Bamadazi aki is this beautiful word in our language that means an earth being. It doesn't mean he or she, it doesn't mean a person or a tree. It means a being who lives here on the earth. And Bimadazi aki, I don't think was going to slide into English very easily, but the last part of that word is aki. Aki, which is our word for the earth. And what about that last sound, ki? Could we slide ki into our own language right beside he, she, ki, and it, so that we could speak of the living world as a being, as a person, not necessarily a gendered person, not a human person, but an earth being worthy of our respect, a subject, not an object. And we'll need a plural pronoun as well. And in English, we have already just the right word. We're simply going to, oops, there, I seem to be frozen again. There we go. The word kin. Let's just add an N to ki, to have kin, so that when we see the geese in the sky, we can say the geese are flying north. They're coming back to us. Kin are returning home. We're so glad to see you. I've worked with my students and various other groups in practicing using these words, and it is a little bit cumbersome at first, of course. But the universal response from my students and others who have tried to adopt these pronouns is that something changes in you when you speak of the world as kin and ki, as our respected relatives, not as things. Now, this might seem like a linguistic point of interest, nothing more than that. But indeed, embedded in this ancient idea of personhood and the grammar of animacy that is central to the Indigenous worldview and absent from the Western worldview, if we go back to those two lenses on the world, the Western worldview views all of these beings as objects, whereas in the Indigenous worldview, they are our relatives. This idea of the personhood and relationships is finding its way into very interesting phenomena. You are looking here at the sacred Wanganui River of the Maori people. Perhaps you know that just after decades of creative work, by the Maori leadership, the sacred Wanganui River now is acknowledged to have the legal rights of a person, the legal rights of personhood, that river has the right to be undisturbed by other beings. We live in a nation that grants legal personhood to corporations and to humans, and none at all to rivers or salamanders or butterflies or the maples of Maple Nation. But we can change that, and it is changing around us as we speak. Not only in New Zealand, but in Ecuador, did you know that in their constitution, the rights of Mother Nature are enshrined in the constitution? Mother Earth can take you to court and has. I don't want to oversimplify in any way the tremendous challenges of acting on these constitutional provisions, but it is an aspiration and a statement of the personhood of all living beings. This same understanding, based on the Indigenous lens or worldview on the land, is part of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. which was brought to the UN by Indigenous nations, by Ecuador and Bolivia. A few years ago, I had the great privilege and honor of addressing the General Assembly on exactly this, the rights of Mother Earth. It has not yet been passed by the United Nations, but its time is coming, and you can be a part of that movement, the movement which is known as the rights of nature, which is creating this whole new system of law, of jurisprudence that is rooted in this notion of showing respect for the living world as beings, as persons, as relatives, not as natural resources, not as commodities. It challenges the idea that the earth is our property. It shifts that lens from what does land mean? Property, natural resources, capital, to say, no, no, no. Land is our home, the home of our relatives. It is the place where we enact our responsibilities, not the place where we claim our rights. So the rights of nature movement is deeply aligned with the Indigenous worldview, and is a way that the Indigenous worldview becomes a global phenomenon to restructure our relationships with land by changing our ideas of nature, your topic again of your seminar. Rights of nature simply says that nature in all its life forms has the right to exist. Fancy that. To persist, to maintain and regenerate its vital cycles. No more than that. It is a paradigm shift from property law to natural law, from this fiction that we can have a continual expansion of economic growth. You can't have continual expansion in a finite world. It's impossible. We need a shift to sufficiency, to enoughness that is cultivated by gratitude. A shift from considering human exceptionalism, that is, that the one species that really matters on Earth is humans, to the well being of all, to a recognition that all flourishing is mutual. None of us can survive and flourish unless we all do. And from a it based, rights based model of exploitation of the Earth, to a responsibility based ethic of reciprocity with the living earth. And these ideas don't just exist on paper. They are being used all over the world increasingly. In 2017, the Ponca Nation, Indigenous peoples, for the most part, embracing these ideas and these new laws. The Ponca people used rights of nature declarations to protect their own land and water from the dangers of fracking. The Ho-Chunk Nation changed their constitution to protect their riverbeds from fracking as well. There have already been held 4 now rights of nature international tribunals. What does the earth ask of us? Respect. Reserving legal personhood for a single species in language and ways of living perpetuates this fallacy of human exceptionalism, that we humans are fundamentally different, better, more deserving of the wealth and services of the earth than any other species. Recognition of the personhood of other beings asks that we relinquish our role as this perceived masters of the universe in control and in charge of everything, and celebrate instead our kinship, our essential role as an equal member in the democracy of all species. It is a call to justice for other species, to justice for all peoples. And I'm reminded in closing of the words of a great teacher of mine, the late clan mother from Onondaga Nation, Audrey Shenandoah, who said our job as people is to seek justice, not just for ourselves, but justice for all creation. mi'u, miigwech. Thank you.
Dr. Kimmerer, thank you so much for such a wonderfully inspiring lecture. I think there were the most ideas of nature presented of any of our lectures in 9 years, and I'm just so thrilled that you were able to join us tonight. I'd like to introduce now Megan Dixon, who's going to be running the Q&A. Megan Dixon is the head of the College of Idaho Henberg Environmental Lectureship, and I'd like to welcome her to the stage. And if you haven't put in your questions yet, there's still time to, in the Q&A function, to add your question. Professor Dixon?
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you, Dr. Kimmerer, again, also for your talk. We have a few questions that have come in so far, and I'll try and keep track of more. One early one is, I think, trying to get at how you might see these ideas sitting next to ideas we sometimes use still more in a Western context to try and explain some of these relationships, like right brain, left brain, you know, the way that we understand humans as thinking abstractly versus holistically, and maybe wondering if that is a helpful language to get at some of these ideas. And so I think, how do you find that endeavor of trying to communicate to other people, whether you need a language that connects to something like that, or you just try to start fresh?
That's an interesting idea. I've never really cast it in that way. But what it reminds me of is that within the Western lens, and certainly within academia, and many of us are in the university in this listening audience, we tend to privilege the intellect above all, don't we? We say, thank you, Cartesian dualism, that we say that we value the mind more than anything else, right? And in Western science, the body in terms of what we can measure and observe, empirical information. But we explicitly exclude emotional knowledge and spiritual understanding. Whereas at least in Potawatomi ways, we recognize the holism of the medicine wheel that suggests that we have these 4 ways of understanding the world, and it might map in some way onto left brain, right brain, but the way we conceive of it is to say that we have the gift of mind, body, emotion, and spirit, and that we need to use them all. And we say that if we try to understand a problem without exercising all of those faculties, we probably don't really understand it. And so I always appreciate that discipline of being able to say, have I thought about this from all of these different directions? And so that's how I would think of it in response to this whole brain thinking of the questioner.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very helpful. Another person just put in kind of a comment about where happiness comes from. And it is kind of widely quoted now, you know, that happiness comes from gratitude. This person heard it quoted on an interview. Could you say more about the understanding of maybe of gaining happiness through gratitude, or whether it's joy? How maybe you or other Native people you know understand getting that sense of contentment that, of course, today we often see represented as getting more stuff.
Right. Yeah, which is a whole nother question of how do we define well-being and wealth and success? By how much stuff we have? That's where the practice of gratitude, I think, becomes really important, because the practice, and I don't mean just, you know, simple thank you, polite kind of gratitude. I mean, real engagement with understanding what it is that enables us to be alive, and what a gift it is to be alive, and how does that happen? We're supported by all these other lives. And when you stop, and we're back to pay attention to all of those beings, you can't help but feel wealthy, 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 in all the relationships that you have, in the fact that you have food and water and air and beauty and bird song. And I mean, you when you recognize all of those things, having the latest gadget or having more of something else just kind of falls away because you realize you have everything that you need. And and I truly think that it is a radical economic act to be content and not succumb to all these messages of you need to buy more. Well, the more we consume, the more we degrade our planet. What is it that you really want? That next new thing,
Yeah.
or a livable climate?
Right. Right. Yes. Good question. Yeah, we have a number of questions about gaining more understanding about the rights of nature and how that might play out. Quite an interesting one from John asks, basically, how do we present, if we did give nature rights in our current legal settings, how would we prevent a misrepresentation of nature and what she wants in those legal settings, which are so subject to manipulation?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're asking just the right question. And those are the questions that the reason that it took so many decades to get the rights of nature for the Wanganui River in place. Just those questions. Who speaks for the river? Who speaks for the river? And the way in that case that it was brought together is not one voice. It is a coalition of voices that speak for the river. But what that also means is that you have to know the river. It means you have to listen to the river. And we can listen with science, certainly, but we also listen with ceremony. We listen with intuition as well as objectivity. We listen all around the medicine wheel and come to a shared understanding. It's not easy. It's not easy, but it's the right thing.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have specifics. There are questions also that ask, are there parts in existing law that have been more productive for this work? Or does it seem again to be kind of a starting over or an introducing of a new document or something?
I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm probably not the right person to answer this in a really granular way. But the notion is that yes, it's a kind of starting over, so that the suppositions are to extend personhood to more than humans, and that personhood isn't a kind of anthropomorphism. It's not to say that a river is a person, or that wild rice, for example, has been granted the rights of personhood. We're not saying that it's a human person. We're saying it's a rice person, and that their interests need to be understood. So it is a whole new legal framework. And at the forefront of this are many great minds and legal scholars who are doing this amazingly creative work.
Yeah, thank you. We have a message of thanks for how you write about wild strawberries in your book. Someone here from Idaho feels the same way about huckleberries, which grow wild here, so similar. Another question related is how you've noticed climate change affecting, the very cultural foundations of Indigenous peoples, and what you might want to share about that as the places that we live in change out from under us.
Yeah. Two responses. First of all, to the person who is shouting out and celebrating huckleberries. Yes to berries. And the reason I want to invoke that is that berries to me really embody this notion of the gifts of the living world that are designed for reciprocity. In fact, in our Potawatomi language, the root word for gift and the root word for berry are the same thing. To say that the berries our gifts, and we could take a lesson from them. And what does it mean to be a gift? Because the berries are constantly in reciprocity, aren't they? You know, the berries give to the birds and to the people, but there's an expectation of reciprocity that in return for that berry, we're going to disperse seeds and so on. So I really appreciate that celebration of berries, because they are our teachers of what reciprocity looks like. And oops, now I forgot what, climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, just a few years ago, we had a convening of Indigenous leaders, women leaders, to talk about this very thing in the Northeast, where in Maple Nation, where our sugar maples are threatened by climate change. And among the things that the leaders really reported on were changes in timing, in phenology for the reproductive cycles of medicines, for example, traditional medicines, as well as for traditional agricultural plants and other cultural keystone species. They were noticing the seasonal shifts and the asynchronies that are present. But what brought us together was to understand that our plants and animals will become climate refugees. They already are. And how is it that we as human people can help our plant and animal relatives move to the places that they need to be? And how do we establish relations with those others who are coming toward us? So it's all about creating relationship, not to say that nature is a moving target. It's always changing. It's changing way too fast right now, but it's the relationship to nature that really needs to be nurtured as well.
That's actually a wonderful opening to another question that asks, how can it be possible for non-native people to become more native to a place? What should people do if they want to, in that phrase that people use now, become native to place?
Yeah, well, you know, I think the reason I hesitate to answer immediately is that, to me, that is the story of braiding sweetgrass. It explores exactly that question. How do we become at home? How do we cease being settlers, colonists, set aside that frontier mentality and live here as if it mattered, live here as if our grandchildren were going to live here? And to me, the easiest, the simplest, not the easiest, the simplest answer is by engaging in reciprocity with the place, to recognize that in return for everything that you're given, what will you give back to your place? And that you're entering into a relationship. And isn't that what makes us feel like we belong? That, to me, that's what being native to place means, is belonging there. And we cultivate belonging with exchange, with rolling up our sleeves and paying attention and, you know, participating in the healing of that place. We learn to speak its language. We learn the names of the plants and animals. All of those are ways to become at home in a place and stop being
thank you. I think there are a few questions that ask basically, what can individuals reading your book or starting to think about this do in their own communities? And you might extend the same answer perhaps, but I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the Indigenous people in Idaho who do so much good work and are present with us and working on things like the salmon restoration and so forth. But how would you recommend starting in your own place if you'd like to try to see these ideas or bring about more restoration?
Yeah. And that call from Audrey Shenandoah to enact justice for the land, justice for all creation, to me, one of the ways we do that is with healing, is with restoration. And it can be, of course, in supporting sovereignty and treaty rights and the work of First Nations people who are leading the way in this biocultural restoration. It can also be as simple as restoration in your own backyard. the notion of irrigated lawns that are emitters of so much carbon dioxide, as opposed to native habitat gardens around your home that are refuges for pollinators and birds, and in fact sequester carbon rather than emit carbon. That is a really small scale and powerful act of restoration. It's also an act of education, because then when your neighbors see what you're doing and understand what you're doing, they say, that house right there, that has ecological citizens living in it. It has givers living there, not takers. It can be a real badge of honor.
That's great. There's another really interesting question about the pronouns you propose, which are lovely, and asking, is there a possessive pronoun that goes along with them?
When I use it, I just use it as if it was its. So it's, I'm saying, Keys nest, Keys tree. I just use it that way.
Okay. Yeah.
I try not to be prescriptive about it, though, because I think the magic is when people find a way to use it themselves.
Yes, right. That's lovely. Yeah. So, and there's another nice question here from a teacher, evidently of teenagers, and was reading from your book, Gathering Moss, and speaking of the 4 ways of knowing in that quotation, and wonders what you would recommend to instructors of young people to inspire them to take on more ways of knowing. At the most basic level, maybe more field trips, but are there other things you might recommend?
Yes, in the educational arena, I often in workshops will have, with teenagers and above, have them actually write from each one of those quadrants of the medicine wheel. Engage in a description of a being in the living world and write about it using only the mind, using only the body, using only emotional intelligence. And in that way, you really distinguish the powers of each of them. And I found that to be really effective. And then the writers have a notion of how to use them all together. They realize what they were missing by not engaging them. So you might try that.
That's lovely. There's a couple of questions I see as related, so I'll try and frame them. One is specifically about a local challenge here in our valley of trying to preserve farmland in the face of urbanizing development, given increasing population, and the assumption that land is meant to, be your retirement fund if you have no other retirement fund, because some people don't. But it's also, I think, connecting to another question about how to operate in a situation where so many people might not agree with you about changing an understanding of land. And that's a very big question for one person, but I think we wonder what you would recommend as trying to explain why changing perspective is important.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because if there's anything more polarizing, it is those two lenses on what land means. And while that can be polarizing, it also strikes me that in a time in our society when we are at odds with one another in many ways, we're looking for common ground, right? And what is a better meeting place for common ground than land? And if we use those two lenses and really name how we understand land, we see that dichotomy that I presented to you of the indigenous way of thinking about land and the Western way is they're really not two boxes. There's a continuum there, that people value their land also as a connection to their ancestors and to their children, and to talk about it in that way. What do you really value about land? Is land more than property? And to start that that conversation. And in so many cases, the answer is yes, it's a lot more than property. And if we think about the love that we have for the land and try to grow common ground from that, I think there's promise there.
Yeah. Someone asks whether you could comment on the appointment of Deb Holland to Department of Interior. And she seems to be getting underway right away. What you could say about that?
It's extraordinary. It is extraordinary to think that the agency which is responsible for directing the extermination of our people is now headed by a Native woman. The historic symbolism of this is makes you believe that justice is possible. And she has an extraordinary responsibility and the potential to transform our relationships to land, because she has a big platform to speak about land as if it was more than capital, as if it was more than property. And the notion that, public land, right? What is public land? Every single acre of public land is ancestral homelands, is indigenous homelands. So when we talk about the disposition of public lands, to recognize that every bit of that is indigenous homelands, that shouldn't then we be accountable to that history. It's all well and good to have our land acknowledgements, right? And we say, oh, well, they're important, and I don't want to underestimate them. They're important, but we have to act on them. And what are we called to do? How are we called to live differently when we recognize that we're living on stolen land? That creates a whole different dynamic. And Secretary Holland is an amazing hero, and to me, to many Native people, and it really fills me with hope for what is possible. And I want us collectively to support her in every way possible.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much more time we have. We have so many questions. There's one I definitely want to acknowledge about, it says a struggle to preserve a geyser where there was a water claim to try and drain the Cowlitz River and aquifer. And this seems to be in Washington state. And it's a person who says, was trying to explain, I think, her people's connection to ancestral land, to the salmon people, to the animals. And, it's about how do you talk to people who are non-native, sitting in that frame of a certain policy? Do you have words of encouragement or advice for that ongoing struggle?
I don't know anything about the particulars. I wish I did. But when we speak for the water, and in my culture, Anishinaabe women have a particular responsibility to speak for the water. And the way that I would encourage that dialogue is, again, the common ground of water. It's not empty words when we say water is life, and that water is a gift. It should not ever be commodified, and is a human right to water. It's also more than a human right. It's rights of nature. Salmon need water, plankton need water, beaver need water. So if there's any realm in which we can really understand the world as gift that belongs and nurtures all beings, it would be in the case of water. And I would hope that you can speak that with courage and heart to your listeners.
Maybe I'll try and take this one more. I'm trying to just reword it. It's long, and I think a good one is about Indigenous protected and conserved areas and stewardship initiatives are being funded more and more through government programs. And so they're being, mentioned and celebrated, but maybe don't get as much funding as they ought to. And so this might be a bit of a technical question, but do you see avenues to get more public support and resources put behind Indigenous-led stewardship for that to happen more?
I would, first of all, want to lift up exactly the phenomenon that the questioner is bringing to us. There is certainly increased, but still highly inadequate funding from government agencies for this. But the kinds of creativity and innovation in land protection through Indigenous land trusts, through cultural easements, through cultural respect agreements, through granting land access and tenure to Native people. There's so many solutions out there that operate outside of government funding and are Indigenous led, that it's remarkable. In tribal national parks, for example, tribal wilderness areas, there's a whole panoply of solutions that are Indigenous led out there, and I would hope that they would have a great deal of support as well.
And one person asked too, are there any specific Indigenous-led organizations you'd like to mention to us for our support? Again, I invite people to cast around in Idaho. There are some here, but maybe are there some that you would choose to mention?
Yeah, I'd love to hear about the ones that are in your own.
And I would say I'm still in the learning process, but I think I mentioned to you there's a great program from the Shoshone-Bannock to educate tribal youth called River Nua. And I'm finding our University of Idaho campus and Idaho State have really good support on staff and endeavoring to share this information with the rest of the state. So it's really great to start learning about that, catalyzed, I think, by your joining us. So I'd really like to
wonderful,
thank you for
wonderful.
That. Yeah.
Other national organizations that I would really call out are the Indigenous Environmental Network and Winona LaDuke's Honor the Earth are really important as well. There are many emerging for sure. So I think that the support is most important locally within your own bioregion as a way to celebrate and uphold one's responsibility to the land that you occupy.
That's lovely. Thank you. Well, I think you've been answering questions, I think at least 28 minutes. So thank you so much. I think we see just so much gratitude for your talk this evening in the question and answer section, and many people thanking you for writing with such love of New York and the area around Lake Onondaga, and sharing all of those thoughts with us. One person asked, maybe we can end with this, how you feel about the growing attention to your book, even several years after it was originally published, and how you would account for the sort of groundswell of attention that it continues to get, even though it was published about 8 years ago now, I think.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. The way that I have come to understand it is that the way that braiding sweetgrass is moving in the world, interestingly, is hand to hand. It's from individuals who are saying, I've read this spoke to me, and I think it might speak to you. And they give it to somebody else. This is not a book that has had a big publicity. It's from a wonderful not-for-profit independent press, Milkweed Edition, wonderful publisher. But that's what they're reporting, is that it's being gifted to one another. And I love that, because that's the way sweetgrass moves in the world. you transplant it and you give it to somebody and they make a home for it. So I feel very gratified by that. But what is propelling that? I think that we are living in the time of a great remembering, that we remember what we really value, our connection to the gifts of the earth, our connections to one another, that we might be wanting to reframe ourselves as not just these takers and despoilers of the living world. We want to belong. We want to walk through the world and receive the respectful gaze of our more than human relatives, not to live honorably, and breeding sweetgrass maybe gives a vocabulary and a vision of what that might look like. It's an invitation to be an ecological citizen, not a consumer.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for submitting all your questions. There's some great thoughts and gratitude there. And thank you for answering so many of them. I appreciate it.
My pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Professor Dixon, for that very thoughtful moderation. And thank you again to Miss Emily for your very wonderful and moving introduction, and to Professor Kimmerer, really just such an astounding lecture, has given us so much to think about. And for all our participants tonight, we had the biggest turnout we've ever had in all of our 9 years, and I'm just so thrilled. So many people joined us from so many places, and including 8 different states all around the U.S., and even someone coming in from Bolivia. And I'm just really gratified we were able to do this during this difficult year. So thank you to all of you. We will continue in next year with another set of speakers. So if you'd like to join the mailing list, please email me at ideaofnature@boisestate.edu. And I'm just so pleased we all could gather tonight. And thank you again, Professor Kimmerer. We're just so grateful to have your presence in our community. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.